In this reflection, I would like to reflect on a perplexing dilemma that I often encounter in scrupulous people. I find it perplexing, but at the same time, completely understandable. The dilemma that I encounter is the false choice that scrupulosity often presents. The dilemma can be summarized in this way. I can be happy without worry and anxiety, ignoring my thoughts of sin. However, if I ignore the demands of scrupulosity, I will probably freely be placing myself in peril and taking the risk of damnation. The opposite choice, I can be safe and secure following each of the rules, rituals, and isolating choices diligently and without wavering, and in this way be assured of salvation. The choice proposes that disregarding the anxiety and living with the rigidity of certitude might make real joy impossible, but perhaps it's worth it in exchange for everlasting life. I state that this is understandable with the crooked reasoning that scrupulosity champions, but it's also a false choice. This false choice incorrectly assumes that salvation is somehow merited, somehow earned, and disregards that salvation is a gift of God. Salvation cannot be earned or merited. Salvation can only be lived. Salvation can be celebrated, but it is truly impossible to earn something that is a gift. The crooked thinking of scrupulosity transforms a gift of God into the reward of the virtuous. It removes entirely from the equation that salvation is a gift from God and that God is ultimately unrestrained in his generosity. Are you jealous because I am generous? Even more fundamentally, it is a false choice, championed by a deeply flawed and contradictory image of God. It is dependent on an image of God in which God is understood as the strict Father, all good and all powerful. It supports the perception of an image of God that is rooted in the flawed notions of unrestrained, unfiltered, and unquestioned form of patriarchy, which has long been dismissed as inadequate and harmful to the human spirit. Patriarchy may at one time in human history made some kind of sense, but it is no longer a defensible position to exclude over 1/2 of all humanity simply for reasons of gender. The author and commentator George Lakoff and others explain that the strict father ideology expects the individual person to possess the discipline required to follow God's commandments. In this viewpoint, God is ultimately punitive. He punishes those who do not follow his commandments and rewards those who do. Following God's laws takes discipline. Those who are disciplined enough to be moral are disciplined enough to become blessed and ultimately saved. The strict father image of God stands in stark contrast to the Abba of Jesus. The Abba of Jesus is anything but strict, but perhaps better understood and perceived as confounding and unexpected. The conventional and patriarchal wisdom of the day is routinely reversed by Jesus when he speaks of his Abba. It is impossible to read any of the parables of Jesus and not be challenged by the overwhelming and unexpected generosity of Abba, Father. The love and generosity of the Abba is abundant, overflowing, exceeds all expectations. How is it possible to believe even for a moment that the Abba of Jesus is in any fashion a strict and punitive father is impossible to comprehend. The only way to understand an image of the Abba God of Jesus as a strict father, or for that matter, any image of God that contradicts the Abba of Jesus, is to assume that the cultural ideology of those who benefit most from a system of reward and punishment somehow persist. As unfortunately true that may be, the gospel evidence does not support such an image of God. It clearly contradicts it. The gospel reversal of the understanding of God from a strict father to an Abba father enraged the Pharisees and the scribes. On the other hand, the poor and the little ones were overjoyed. It is most certainly beyond the scope of this reflection to reflect on how such a contradiction has any real traction in the Christian tradition. How any image of God other than the Abba of Jesus persists in the hearts and minds of the followers of Jesus is perplexing. Certainly an examination of the many different layers of culture and human experience that today overlays the gospel story is applicable. Undoubtedly, there were and are groups of people who would obviously profit from a strict father understanding of God and who would reject the Abba Father of Jesus out of hand. Regardless, for our reflection, it's enough to acknowledge the distortion and to continue to reflect on the perplexing dilemma. Does Jesus demand only the safe choice? Or does he accept a choice that leads to the experience of real joy and celebration? I think the answer is obvious, and we need to go no further than the gospel stories in support of the assertion. Not to pick and choose an isolated phrase from the Gospels, but rather to read the entire story in context and not in isolation from the lived experience of the people of God. Within the Christian tradition, as a follower of Jesus, to give up everything for one thing is a fair deal when we are speaking about the kingdom of God. On the other hand, to give up everything, joy, for one thing, safety, makes no sense at all. It is a fundamental distortion of what it means to be a human being, made in the image and the likeness of God. It is certainly not kingdom living or representative of an authentic and orthodox Christian tradition. There is true anxiety when a person chooses to reject a perspective on life that is distorted. For a scrupulous person to let go of their image of God as the strict father and to replace it with the Abba of Jesus, anxiety and even fear is to be expected. However, it is not a paralyzing fear that freezes a person in their tracks and makes change impossible. It is rather the exhilarating freedom that a person feels when they understand that things will be different when I make this change. I can assert this with confidence because I am a firm believer in the actual and sanctifying grace of the Spirit of God. God does not invite us to growth and health and leave us on our own, fumbling in the darkness. Rather, as we make this change, we can expect with confidence the light of truth that will show the way. The real invitation in the Christian life is not an invitation to either or. The Christian mindset, the Christian position is a both and, the already and the not yet. As St. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 12, now we see things imperfectly, like puzzling reflections in a mirror. but then we will see everything with perfect clarity. Even when we see with less clarity and definition than we might desire, the truth is still brighter and clearer than the illusion of what is false and does not lead to life. Learning to manage your scrupulosity will help you to experience life with a real sense of freedom, hope, compassion, and generosity. All of this is the result of rejecting the false promises of certitude, which is unattainable for any person, let alone for a person who suffers with a disorder such as scrupulosity. The real choice is life, not safety. The real choice is freedom, not damnation. The real choice is relationships and encounter, not isolation and rigidity.